Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Randa Slim. I'm a fellow here in the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and director for the Track 2 initiatives at the Middle East Institute. MEI and SAIS are pleased to welcome you to this discussion on Lebanon's refugee crisis and Lebanon's socioeconomic developmental challenges with Mr. Philippe Lazzarini. A country of 4.5 million that is hosting 1.2 million Syrian refugees on top of the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, Iraqi refugees. Lebanon is facing overwhelming security, economic, and demographic challenges. As the Syrian war enters its 7th year with no end in sight, there is increasing need to address the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon through both the short-term humanitarian relief lens and the medium to long-term socio-economic development lens. Last April at the EU conference in Brussels addressing reconstruction in Syria, Lebanese officials presented a vision for the stabilization and development in Lebanon. The Lebanese proposal addresses the massive infrastructure, environmental, power, water, and education pressures caused by the Syrian refugee crisis. It's a multi-billion-dollar program which proposes a funding collaboration between the World Bank through concessionary loans, the international community, and the private sector. At best, this is a stopgap to a protracted problem for Lebanon, Syria, and the region. Nothing will help Lebanon and bring more hope to the Syrian refugees than ending the war in Syria, and for the Syrian refugees to return to their homes and to their country. Without further ado, let me turn to the task at hand and introduce our featured speaker. He will make a few introductory remarks, after which we'll move to a facilitated conversation with our guests, including plenty of time for your questions before we close about 1:30 or a bit before that. It's my pleasure again to welcome for the second time at FPI the Deputy UN Special Coordinator for Lebanon, Mr. Lazzarini. He is the Resident and Humanitarian Programs Coordinator and UN Development Program Resident Representative in Lebanon. He has extensive experience in humanitarian assistance and international coordination in conflict and post-conflict areas, including his last assignment prior to spring 2015 as Deputy Special Representative, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in the UN Assistance Mission in Somalia. He has also held a number of senior positions in the UN for the coordination of humanitarian affairs and in various field positions in Iraq, Angola, Somalia, and the occupied Palestinian territories. His earlier career included service with the International Committee of the Red Cross and in the private sector. Mr. Lazzarini is in Washington for official meetings, and we are very delighted that he built in time for this public event and look forward to his remarks. Please join me in welcoming Philippe Lazzarini.
Thank you very much, Randa, for the welcome, and thank you to Hopkins University and to the Middle East Institute for inviting me for a second time to talk about Lebanon. I think last time was more or less a year ago. I mean, you started by saying, well, we are 7 years into a conflict, and Lebanon, no doubt, is one of these tiny countries in the region which has been severely hit by the Syrian crisis, but also by the Syrian presence in the country. As you know, this has created a number of challenges, among them socioeconomic challenges, demographic challenges, and also security challenges. We have in this country, we keep saying we have the highest number of refugees per capita. Basically, it's 25 to 40% of the overall population. So imagine what this would mean in the scale of Europe or in the scale of the United States. It's a country which has shown extraordinary, I would say, hospitality. At the beginning of the crisis, host communities and Lebanese have opened their doors, opened their hospital, opened their health center. But we are 7 years into the crisis, and more, what we can observe is the emergence of an hospitality fatigue in the country. And this was very well illustrated by Prime Minister Hariri when he went to Brussels, and he was telling the story of Abdallah. Abdallah, father, 5 children living in a very poor, remote area in Arson, Arson being one of these areas where we have a massive presence of refugees. He's living in a tiny shack, open, the door of his house to another family of 4 children. And at the beginning of the crisis, you had some international organization knocking at the door and providing assistance, to the refugee family. And Abdallah started to have second thoughts because he said, well, I'm as poor as the people who are here, and basically I'm not benefiting of this type of assistance. And this has created or is creating a number of tension in the country. Now, if we look at, 7 years into this crisis, poverty, is in the rise. Between 2014 to 2017, the number of people living with less than $3 a day has doubled, and today we talk about 1.2 million people living in this condition. Among them, 1 million Syrian, but among them also we have 300,000 Lebanese. So more and more, what we observe in a country is the emergence of some social tension. The social tension, can be triggered sometimes by the total lack of infrastructure in municipalities. We have about 70–80% of the refugees living in 250 municipalities in the country, and these municipalities most of the time have very little, if no real, infrastructure to provide basic social services. So I went, for example, recently to visit Arson. One of the main reason of tension in this community is the total absence of water sewage system. And because of the massive presence of the refugees, this is an issue which cannot be dealt by the host community. Elsewhere, like in Arson, the story of Abdallah, you have more and more mayors threatening, to evict the refugees from their municipalities. In other places, like in Zahle, people start to be worried about the impact on the tourism sector and are also tempted, to move the refugees from the municipality. But what we see more and more are tensions which are related, to the competition in the labor market, since Lebanese see most of the time, an unfair competition coming from the Syrian in the country. So more and more, if we look at the map, the evolution this year is telling us that, tension are appearing. Now, with no real political insight, being 7 years into the impact of the conflict, now the question is, how will, the international aid or the response to these challenges evolve? To answer this question, I think we have to go back a little bit about how this assistance in country has evolved. If we go back to the beginning of the crisis in 2012, when we have the massive influx of refugees, the first reaction of the government, and I would even say the Lebanese, was, well, we are opening our border, these people are coming here, it's up to the international community to address the need of the people, since this is an international public good and we are doing our share by opening the border. But 2 years into the conflict, and the impact of the crisis, communities, felt more and more the presence. The story of Abdallah in all the municipalities where the refugees are present. And that's when, for the first time, we say, well, if we want to mitigate the impact of the crisis for the country, we need also to include host community in our response. And that's what Randa referred to when you were talking about the Lebanese crisis response plan, where basically we started to address the impact of the crisis by saying, on one hand, the refugees. On the other hand, we have to promote social cohesion. We need to promote, support to the municipalities to make sure that this crisis for the host communities is also turning into new opportunities. Because the municipalities where all the refugees are, most of the time, they are living in the most impoverished area, remote area, an area which have been completely neglected over the last few decades in terms of investment and infrastructure. So that was a little bit the reasoning going on. By the way, when I started in Lebanon 2 years ago, I have to say the anxiety talking about the presence of the Syrian in country was so deep that there was a kind of a denial that this situation can or will last. And so it was almost impossible to talk about a long-term response in the country, because that would have meant unconsciously for the Lebanese trying to integrate the Syrian in the society, for which I think many of you know this is a red line, since the only solution the Lebanese can accept in order not to impact its subtle, I would say, balance between the communities will be either the return of the refugees the day there is a political solution, and for the most vulnerable, resettlement policies. But we all know how difficult the resettlement policies are all about. Hence, we need to think in terms of temporary measure. Last year, we had the London conference, and the London conference has been a turning point, because for the first time, the government reckoned that we need a multi-year plan. And by having a multi-year plan, basically they expected that the international community also commits on a multi-year basis. And that was London all about. And that's in London, we have been able to raise $12 billion for 4 to 5 years for the region. And I would say that Lebanon most likely had also its fair share, since only in 2016, we reached a total support for $1.6 to $1.8 billion in London. I do believe that after London, there have been a certain number of successes. There were, some expectation from the Lebanese side, but there were also expectations from the international community. And among the successes, clearly the education, which has been portrayed as being also an example of generosity and hospitality by the Lebanese. We succeeded to enroll more than 200,000 Syrian children in the various schools. This is a half full glass, because the half empty glass is that we still have about 200 to 300,000 children which are completely out of the school system. So we had, after London, Brussels this year, and the objective of Brussels was to make sure that the international solidarity is re-expressed after London. And that was important because over the last year, there have been competing new emergencies in the world, and that's the reason why we needed to make sure that the attention continued to remain, not only on the Syria file, but also on the impact of the Syrian crisis in the neighboring countries. And if the expectation of Brussels were to reiterate this support of the international community, I do believe that the Brussels conference has been a success. If the expectation were of a political nature, most likely Brussels was not as successful as one would have expected. But the good thing is that the aid will be continued in 2017-18. But what is evolving now? And what did the Prime Minister propose? Basically, what we say is the response to the refugees, the response to the host communities has not been sufficient to turn the tide of further pauperization, poverty in the country. It has maybe slowed it down, but it has not turned the tide. In London, we were saying, let's create 300,000 jobs. I mean, let's be clear, we did not succeed to create 300,000 jobs in 1 year. But who could create 300,000 jobs in a country where, I mean, all the economic indicators are in the red? You have no confidence from international investors. You have so many political uncertainties, and the traditional economic activities in the country have been badly hit because most of the export sector have slowed down, if not shut down. So that was a little bit utopic, mission impossible. We could not, succeed with this statement. So the observation has been to say, well, if international investors are not coming by themselves, we have to trigger, investment in the country. So we expect that the response, or if we want to walk the talk and make sure that the crisis becomes also an opportunity for the country, we have to go from a response to the refugees, to the host communities, now to Lebanon as a host country, meaning by this needs to be complemented by a policy which would generate and create a growth by a macroeconomic policy. And the lead can only come from the government, hence the proposal by the Prime Minister, which is supported by the international community, to say, let's be a little bit more ambitious. Let's look at what are the available instruments within the international community to fund large-scale infrastructure. By doing this, we will create jobs in the country. By doing this, we will also modernize totally obsolete infrastructure in the country. And by doing so, possibly also we are investing in the future, and we are investing in a country which can position itself for future reconstruction in the region. So basically, that's where we are. There are important remaining challenges, as we know. One of them, which is considered as being a real ticking bomb, are the 500,000 youth between the age of 14 and 25 who are neither enrolled in any education system or vocational training, and who are not part of the labor market. And indeed, this is becoming also one of our joint priorities. Creating jobs means also targeting this group of people. All this, Randa, clearly is a policy to be put in place in the absence also of a political solution, since for the time being we are not, no one is expecting a large voluntary return in the coming years, or even in the coming couple of years. I think I will stop here for an introductory remark. Thank you.
Thank you. These were excellent remarks. Thank you for them. And setting both the historical context of how the Lebanese government has over time come to, as you said, move from a denial phase to an acceptance phase to a action phase, proactive phase. So that's a good development, in my opinion. I would like to focus on one particular aspect that you talked about, which is this ticking time bomb. This, you and I have talked in the past in Beirut, 500,000 youth. And these are Syrian and Lebanese, or just Syrian?
Both.
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 Okay, Syrian and Lebanese who are out of a job, who are not enrolled in educational system. And, that has always been one of the arguments I've always said. These are potential guns for hire, in the future. What are specific programs that you are entertaining in this, in terms of vocational school? Besides creating jobs, we are talking about people who are 15, 16, 17, So is it more vocational schools? What are the specific programs that you guys have been thinking about?
For the time being, if we look at the project or program, it's primarily some vocational training facilities within the various communities, which normally are implemented jointly with, I would say, local authorities and UN agencies. But again, these are what I would qualify a micro project. I mean, it might reach 100 people here, 50 people here, and so on. But it's still not yet, I would say, a national program or policy to try to address, I mean, the issue of skilled labor, I mean, for the people, to prepare them, I mean, for, I mean, the future reconstruction of the country, making sure they are getting skills, but while getting skills, be also busy enough and have a sense in the daily life. So I would say there is nothing yet at a national scale, but there is now a deeper awareness that if this is not seriously tackled, I mean, that is becoming a real ticking bomb. Now, this is also in addition, you might have known, so some of you have seen also, that we have issued recently the Human Development report on the youth in the Arab world. And if you look at Lebanon, I mean, Lebanon, number one, you have a high unemployment rate in this category of people, which impacts also the fact that most of the Lebanese ending universities are just leaving the country. So you have also a brain drain going on. And youth also are less and less engaged, I would say, in public life, public institution. And this disenfranchisement is also, I would say, a worrying trend. So that's the reason why it is so important to name the problem. And I think this is quite new, and the Prime Minister started to do. We named the problem by saying, let's address the issue of 500,000 people between the age of 14 and 24, 25, who for the time being are neither enrolled in an education system, training system, or involved in the labor market.
I travel, as you know, frequently to Lebanon, and I was recently there not a long time ago. And what struck me during this last visit in my own conversations with members of the family, friends, people I interact with in a professional setting, is, you mentioned it in your remark, is this high level of negativity, or how to say, toward the Syrian refugees. I mean, people are reaching, Lebanese I'm talking, many people now are talking about, we are getting fed up.
Yes.
And this is, and I'm hearing this for the first time from people who until recently I felt that they don't harbor these kind of xenophobic feelings or ideas. I mean, economically, I think that's a problem, but also, I mean, you see refugees all the time around you in streets, and I mean, it's a problem that for an average Lebanese is he or she is facing every day as they go about. What's are part of the plans some programs at the community level, not necessarily job and all of this, but to bring Lebanese and Syrians together in small communities, starting with children, you know, the kind of cultural programs that can humanize more and more the plight of the Syrian refugees in the eyes of many of the Lebanese, beyond the fact he's there to use our electricity, he's there to use our water, he's there to benefit from our schools, and he's not paying taxes, he's not, no. You know what I mean? So are there programs that you guys are thinking about? Because the tension that I sensed this last visit, these feelings that are being now expressed publicly, you know, by people vis-a-vis the Syrian refugee, it was very shocking for me, to be very honest.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, there are more and more signs of exasperation.
Yes.
And this exasperation is more and more expressed. That was not the case even 2 years ago. 2 years ago, it was still this anxiety and denial. Today, this exasperation starts to be expressed. You have more and more demonstration also going on. You have a boycott movement going on. You have municipalities, I mean, taking some decisions such as imposing ceasefire also, a curfew at night to make sure that, I mean, the Syrians are not mingling, I mean, with the Lebanese at night, for example. So you have a number, I would say, of attitude or event which start to become alarming and which could even deteriorate in the future for many reasons. The trigger could be security incident, but the trigger could also be, the upcoming political election, for example, because we also know that usually election and refugees are not always, the best combination when this is taking place, and I think many of us know it. So that's for the overall trend. When it comes to, initiative promoting social cohesion, I would say that almost all the projects or programs we are putting in place have an aim to promote this social cohesion. Whatever is being provided at the municipality level are activities which usually bring together, Lebanese communities and the Syrian. We make sure that, the projects are not just targeting one given community, but the entire community, including the host community, can benefit it. So yes, I would say this social cohesion aspect is a constant in our programming in country.
One last question before I open it up for our audience for their questions has to do with where the Lebanese government is. And I know it might be a sensitive issue for you to tackle, so feel free to say, I'm not going to answer this. Most of the surveys I've seen of refugees being done with the Syrian refugees is that the majority are not going to go home, when this ends, and who knows when this ends. We have kids who are now born in Lebanon, that's all they have by the time this ends, and who knows when, hopefully sooner than later. All they have known is Lebanon. All they have known is a school in Lebanon. So these kids are not going to go home. More people are now building families in Lebanon, They are living tough situation, but, it's a life they are building. The government of Lebanon has moved, as you rightly pointed, through a number of phases, Is there now a real discussion taking place in Lebanon about this particular aspect, that this country of 4.5 million is going to be most likely a place that has 6 million for the foreseeable future and maybe for the long term? Is there this kind of political recognition, political acceptance, and some kind of long-term strategic planning taking place?
I would say today there is an acceptance that the country has 6 million inhabitants, and that whatever policy, and especially socioeconomic economic policy, needs to be implemented, it should benefit, for the current population in the country. So this type of acceptance, I would say, is now almost a given. It's a given because if you look at all the development plan which have been put in place over the last 2 years, and the substance of the discussion we had in London or in Brussels, we are talking about the next coming 4 years. And when the Prime Minister talks about the master plan, he talks about a plan for the next coming 6-7 years. So that's more or less the timeline. But across the political spectrum and within the Lebanese society, this presence needs still to be on a temporary basis. But now we are talking about a lasting temporary, because we are already 6-7 years into the impact of the conflict. And as you rightly say, if you add 6 years, it's almost already a generation being in the country. So obviously there is still this ambiguity. I wouldn't say that anyone in country is talking about a presence which would mean integration. No one is talking about this. Everyone is still talking about once there is a political situation, and because also of the living condition of the Syrian in Lebanon, we expect and the refugees say the same, we will go back, to Syria. Let me also just make a comment of your previous question before. It's true that people, feel more and more the presence and express this exasperation. But they also do it because Lebanon is badly hit socioeconomically by, the crisis. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when you had the economic boom and all the reconstruction going on in country, you had hundreds of thousands of Syrians, in the country, and no one felt the presence of the Syrians because they were here, they were busy, and they were working, and they were not in competition with anyone else. So it's more, I would say, the socioeconomic environment which is creating also, this situation, because it's not just because of the presence of the Syrian in the country. So politically, I think that's a conversation at one point which needs to take place, but it's still a very sensitive one. It's a sensitive one. It triggers number, I would say, of anxieties also, and obviously, depending on your assumption, you might also make a political statement which does not really fit, the context of Lebanon.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to open it up. We're going to have microphones. Please. Can you wait? Yes, the microphones are circulating. And please state your name and then your question.
I'm Maureen White from the Foreign Policy Institute. Thank you very much, Mr. Lazzarini, for that very helpful update on the Lebanon situation. I wanted to drill down just on one point that you made. You said that the attempt to create very quickly 300,000 jobs through international investment hadn't really happened, largely because international companies weren't willing to deal with the instability and the uncertainty of Lebanon. So that now the Prime Minister had turned towards a macroeconomic growth policy which would help hosts and the refugees by making use of, by looking around for what was the sort of available international investment instruments. By that, did you mean things like the World Bank concessionary loans, or are there other things that Lebanon is thinking of? Thank you.
I think at this point you answer each question, and then toward the end I'll group them. No,
each question. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. We'll see how.
Thank you for raising the question of the concessional facility, since both Lebanon and Jordan, the World Bank, the UN, the Islamic Development Bank have pioneered, this concessional facility. What was the thinking behind it? Basically, we came to an observation that the traditional humanitarian and development system was not enough to respond to all the need of a country like Jordan and Lebanon, the two neighboring countries, which were considered also as middle-income countries and which traditionally cannot tap into the soft loan being made available for fragile countries. And that's the reason why this concessional facility has been put in place. Now, indeed, when we are talking about the upcoming, I would say, master plan of the government, we have in mind, the government has in mind, tapping on diverse sources of funding, among them the concessional facility. So we'll have the concessional facility, possibly also attracting some private investment, and also to look at new countries which might express interest in investing or championing investment in given sector in Lebanon. For example, there have been recently a number of Chinese delegations in country looking at or discussing about investment opportunities or infrastructure opportunities. So yes, the government is looking at a mix of diverse new instruments. The European Union, for example, is also talking about activating the Neighborhood Investment Fund, which is also a facility which could provide this kind of a soft loan to middle-income countries in the Mediterranean region.
Right. Thank you. Paul, microphone.
Thank you. Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute. My question maybe is a bit related to the overall sort of economic development trajectory. And you mentioned in your talks that when the economy is growing in Lebanon, it can carry, and has carried in the past, several 100,000 Syrians in the labor force. And the current economic crisis of Lebanon predates the arrival of these extra Syrians. So in a way, the metaphor in my mind is currently we have a sinking economic ship. And it's not because of the Syrians. There's major policy contradictions that are not creating growth and not creating jobs. And so my question, I mean, it's sort of a model between finding, sort of like the Titanic, is between finding good cabins for these new passengers on a sinking ship, or so that we all sink happily together, or paying attention to some
singing
of the,
while singing.
While singing,
it's a nice way to
holding hands and so on. My question then relates to the international community in dealing with Lebanon, of course, assistance humanitarian, then assistance on soft loans and helping. But a bit like maybe Greece or some other countries where there are fundamental policy contradictions that the Lebanese government and oligarchy is simply not dealing with. And hence, with all the very welcome assistance and so on, we're kind of, enabling the slow sinking of this ship. And things are really, really dangerous and really serious. So my question is, in discussions with the Lebanese government, whether in Brussels or elsewhere, to what degree are some of the sort of structural issues of infrastructure investment, structure of the budget, the corruption problems, insider trading on real estate, fundamentals, are they addressed, or is it, leave that to the Lebanese, we'll just help?
No.
Can I add?
Yes, yes.
And how much of the aid that's being promised is conditional or is being made conditional on addressing these structural issues by the Lebanese government?
Maybe few comments on this. I don't think we will be naive to the point that we will just make sure that we are sinking collectively more comfortably. That's not what we are aiming at. And you're right to point out that there are a number of pre-existing problems which have not been addressed and which, right now are just exacerbated because of the Syrian crisis. But the root cause is definitely not, the Syrian crisis. Corruption, lack of transparency, and the need, to reform, the public sector, the electricity, the water, to review the fiscal base. All these are, I would say, prerequisite, for a successful master plan in the country. So, but now the discussion we have, which is an interesting one, is that on one hand, Lebanon and the Lebanese say, well, we are delivering our share to the international community by hosting, 1.5 million refugees. So they expect that the assistance will be as little conditional as possible because they want this to be a kind of award, for their share vis-à-vis this international public good. Obviously, if we are talking about future concessional loan, discussion on transparency, on reform, will emerge. And in the discussion we have now is to say, fine, this master plan will also have to be accompanied by a roadmap of a reform, to be implemented. So that's for, I would say, the financing mechanism. How far it will go, I don't know yet, because we should also not forget that we have a government now, since 3-4 months. Before this kind of discussion could not really take place, since we had a cabinet but not a functioning cabinet. So that's emerged. It has emerged just before Brussels. It has emerged also during the spring meeting, which has taken place here 2 weeks ago. Now, when it comes to the concessionality of the traditional aid, I have to say that 90% of the traditional aid goes through a multilateral institution, and there is very little, if no bilateral, for the reason you were just giving, because there is no confidence on trust, and there is very few traditional donors who would be ready to process important funding through institutions which are not yet completely accountable, because you cannot just justify it, to your taxpayer. So that's the reason why, the UN agencies, fund and program, or NGOs have developed, I would say, the bulk of the response in the country.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Philip Ellison. I'm not with the Foreign Policy Institute. I'm a private developer and investor. I was last in Beirut in Lebanon less than 2 months ago in March. And among the people I talked to, I get the sense that it's not a matter of xenophobia or concern about Syrians per se. It's really a frustration with processes, and it's not, again, it's not even about corruption or any of those kinds of things. Those are kind of given in many things about politics. But there are structural, as Mr. Salem alluded to, there are structural issues that have to do with literally the way things are done, typically decision-making by consensus, which really in Lebanon means that things are not decided. I look at the example of the offshore, potential offshore hydrocarbon resources. Nothing is being done about it because of the way that ministry and its governing bodies work or don't work. And so the frustration among the public is, and like with the garbage strike and everything else, it's just, hey, you're just not, you don't have the means to confront the problems. And so when things like that are a problem, when you talk about pleading with corporate investors and saying, well, why don't you create jobs over here, or pleading with the Chinese and saying, why don't you invest in our economy, these people are hard-nosed, and they're going to say, hey, I'm not going to put any money into a place where I can't get an answer. So it's not backsheesh, it's getting stuff done, and the process is in place for taking action on public concerns.
Thank you. Did you have a question? Just a comment.
I'm just wondering if that's if you all in the UN understand that, because
Yes.
The UN is not going to fix the problem. The UN is there to help and to have polite conversations with people about these sorts of issues, but ultimately the private sector is going to be the one or the area where this creative power will come from.
The private sector will come in, but the private sector needs public sector it can trust. But in general, beyond the private sector, and I know that there are many Lebanese here, and tell me if you are in disagreement, but there is very little expectation from Lebanese vis-à-vis their own institution. Sometimes, and I think we had this conversation, Randa, I say, in many countries we talk about, building resilience. I think the problem of Lebanon is its over-resilience, because it's so over-resilient that you have no expectation on any public delivery. Look at the Lebanese. They have certainly the best education system, but it's a private one. No expectation on the public system. Health system, no expectation on the public health system. It's a private one. You have a garbage crisis, fine, we'll find another solution. You have no real water, we'll find a solution. You have no electricity, we'll find a solution. There is no social contract. There is no real sense of citizenship, of a responsible citizen having a social contract with institution. And that applies to the individual, but it applies also, to the private sector. And that's the reason why, for example, this government, everybody acknowledged that. And the title of the program is Restore Trust. To restore trust, you have to walk the talk. And not just say, I will restore trust. Show this ability to deliver. Because as long as you are not showing this ability to deliver, people will have exactly the attitude you are describing. And I think this is certainly one of the main challenges.
Yes, ma'am. And I'm going to go in the back, and then I'll come back here. Yes.
Okay. Ellen Siegel, I'm a nurse. This is about Lebanon's refugee crisis. The word Palestinian was only mentioned once in your introduction. In 1948, the refugees thought they also were going home. They are now on their 4th generation, as you know. And I'm sure you have been to Sabra and Shatila and so forth. The NGO money is going to Syrian refugees or Syrian Palestinians. What about this 4th generation? What about the 48 Palestinians? Is that not a crisis?
Philippe.
I know, maybe two comments here. The first one, number one, I should have mentioned the Palestinian, and you're right. The Palestinians certainly the reason why, the Lebanese are so anxious, because as you rightly said, when they came in, it was for a temporary stay, and now we are at the 4th generation. So basically, when they're talking about the Syrian, the analogy is with the Palestinian, and on top of that, the Palestinian presence is intertwined with the recent history, of the country. So this is definitely deeply anchored. The big difference is that the Syrians have a country, whereas the Palestinians have no country. Now, when we talk about mitigating the impact of the Syrian crisis, indeed, the bulk of our, I would say, target are the Syrian, the host communities hosting the Syrian, the Palestinian, the Syrian, and we should never forget, the Palestinian of 48, we have an agency called UNRWA, which is fully, in charge and responsible to provide, these social services. Now, it does not mean that this has addressed, the miserable condition in which, the Palestinians in Lebanon are living. I have visited, I was based in Jerusalem, in Gaza. I visited Palestinian camp in Jordan. I have to say the one in Lebanon are quite appalling compared, to the Palestinian camp in the other places, which is quite surprising. For me, it came as a shock when I saw the living condition of this camp in Sabra Shatila, Ain Elwe, or these places. But having said that, it's not that the Palestinian 48 are not on the map of the response anymore. It pre-existed the Syrian crisis. It might, unfortunately, continue after the Syrian crisis or its impact have been addressed. So in the collective response of the international community, and primarily through UNRWA, the Palestinian 48 are also part of a group of people that we are looking after.
Can I add just a quick question, clarification? What's the number of Palestinian Syrians now? Do you have an approximate about
The
it?
number is about 35 to 40,000 Palestinians from Syria
Who have entered?
Who have entered and who are in the Palestinian camp.
So all of them
country.
have been settled in the Palestinian camps?
in the camp or in the neighborhood of the camp.
But they are,
Yes.
so 35 to 40,000?
Exactly. I think the exact figure, the last figure we had was 38,000,
All right.
something like this.
All right.
So that's the estimate.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, please, ma'am. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Paulette Lee, thank you for your remarks. To what extent has the situation in Lebanon opened the doors to Islamic extremism? And is there a conflict among the cultures because of all of the refugees, Palestinian Syrians, Lebanese, Shia, Sunni, etc.? What's happening culturally? Thank you.
You know, it's a difficult question to answer.
I wasn't put here to ask a simple question.
Or maybe it's a complicated response to be given. I mean, in terms of concern, I mean, when I go back to this 500,000, I mean, news, we believe that there is a potential for extremist group to tap into, I mean, future recruitment. This is a famous ticking bomb, I mean, the Prime Minister or anyone else is referring to. And this is also the reason why, I mean, together with the government and through consultation with the civil society, we are developing a preventive violence extremism agenda, I mean, for Lebanon. That's number one. Number two, as you know, we have very active security forces focusing on containing, I mean, the risk of extremism. And if we talk about the dysfunctionalities of most of the institutions in the country, among the functioning institutions, I mean, basically we have the army and the security forces and the central bank. But that's a different conversation to have. And who are also, I mean, focusing all the intervention in containment policies. Now, has Lebanon generated its own violent extremism in the country? Our concern, beside this 500,000, is not really this one. Our concern has been more about how do we shield the country, I mean, from an expansion of extremism coming from Syria into Lebanon. But having said that, we had a pocket like in Arson or even in Tripoli until recently.
And Al-Helwa also.
Exactly, yeah. Or Ain el-Helwa now. Very limited, very much geographically contained, where we have, I mean, a pocket of violent act from extremism taking place. And the last round of violence has been the one in in the Palestinian camp of Ain el-Helwa, which was in fact related to that.
Now, related to that and extremism, we are hearing from some parties, especially recently in his last speech, Mr. Nasrallah from Hezbollah said of upcoming, you know, battles that are going to take place on the border.
Yes.
To clear up the areas, you know, on both sides of the border of these pockets of Daesh. And has there been now part of the planning by the UN of security precautions for the refugees who live in these border communities which are going to be targeted? Has there been thinking happening, planning happening with the Lebanese security forces, with, you know, other groups, including Hezbollah, about this, or not yet?
I mean, the main region you're referring to is Arson.
Correct.
And Arson, it's a military zone at the border. Indeed, at the border you have the presence of an extremist group.
Correct.
But you have also among the Syrian civilian population relative of these groups.
Exactly.
And since the beginning of the crisis, many times it was suggested to these families, I mean, to come more into Arson, but they always objected, I mean, to move, and that's the reason why they are where they are. So the conversation has taken place more than once, but obviously in this kind of a frontline area, it's quite difficult to force, I mean, civilians to move if they don't want to move. Basically, they are where they are because they can still be reached in terms of assistance, but they remain close, to their relatives.
That's feel basically what,
and they feel protected. They feel less exposed. Now, Arson, for those who don't know Arson, it's a region in the Bekaa Valley where you have the highest number of refugees compared to the host community. Basically, we estimate at about 100,000 refugees there, and you have a population of maybe 20, 30,000. So you have 2 to 3 times more refugees in Arson than, I would say, the estimated host population. We have few other places in country where you have more refugees, but not in this proportion.
Yes.
Arson is really,
yes. And also demographically, where it's situated,
exactly.
it is particularly,
exactly.
I'd say, not a ticking time bomb, but it's a source of concern.
And again, Arson is, when I was referring to containment policy, it's considered as a military area where the Lebanese army is also applying a containment policy. In fact, when you go there, the people are not really free to move out of Arson. It's completely contained.
Yeah. All right, sir, you had a question.
Yes, my name is Russell King. I have a question about one sentence that strikes me from this Lebanon's emerging protest movement leaflet here. It says, no governing coalition, neither the pro-Saudi March 14th nor the pro-Iranian March 8th, have been able to deliver on basic services. Now, I have a question about those two particular groups. What are their compatibilities or lack thereof, and how do Christians in Lebanon respond to this, given the fact that both Saudi Arabia and Iran are both Islamic-ruled states?
How do the Christian community in Lebanon respond to the inability of the government to deliver on services? Or, well, I mean, I did not, it's my problem. I did not get your question, to be very honest. I'm trying to get, did you get the question?
I'm not 100% sure, but maybe I would like to go back to, this resilience of the Lebanese.
Yeah.
Because they have no expectation in basic social services delivery. And it's not just a question of has March 8 or March 14. The political class in Lebanon over the last, I would say, few decades have not been in a position to properly deliver, services. So what's the expectation of the people after that? If you don't expect anything from the state, you expect your respective community to be in a position to deliver it. And when you look at, for example, the Christian community, you will have a number of people from the Christian communities who will access education system which might be provided by its own community. And that's exactly what is going on. What you don't expect from the state institution, you expect your community to provide it. And that's what we define also as being the sectarism of Lebanon, and which is still very much alive. But this would apply for the other communities also. The Shia would also expect, possibly also Hezbollah or other political party, or the community, or the cleric to deliver these services. And the same would apply with any other community. I don't know if it answers your question or not, but...
Yes, ma'am. Yes. In the back. Yes, she's there.
Hi, my name is Priyali. I'm a student of SAIS. I just wanted to ask, a growing number of unaccompanied minors within the refugee population in other countries, at least, I'm not really sure. Is that a case in Lebanon as well? And since you were talking about the youth...
Sorry, I did not get it.
Unaccompanied minors. Okay. The problem of unaccompanied minors.
And since you were mentioned about youth, firstly, does the UN, the funding cut in any way impact, the programs in terms of the refugees in Lebanon, especially whatever percentage is going towards the youth? And what is being done, as Randa said, to ensure that these youth are not picking up guns or getting trafficked or, problems like that? Thank you.
I have no idea what the scope of unaccompanied children in the country. We might have this statistic within UNHCR. We certainly have cases, but I do not think that this is a problem to the extent that we have to name it or to have a campaign on unaccompanied children. If that's the case, that means I would be quite ignorant. So I expect it's not the case for the country. So that's for the unaccompanied children. For the funding cut, that was a question also?
The funding, what's being done in terms of with this particular youth group in terms of preventing them to take guns and engage in violence.
Again, we have a number of a project targeting, this group. For example, just before coming here, I went to Tripoli, to Bab el-Tabane. We have these two communities, in the north, the Alawi community and the Sunni community, which were fighting, over the last decade. I think they stopped fighting only 1 or 2 years ago, but you have a very uneasy calm. And we have invested in a number of projects to bring the youth of the two communities to revive, the front lines between the two different streets, to revive the shops. We have supported a number of local initiatives for them to perform theatrical performance. So basically, number of really targeted social cohesion program initiative for this youth. But again, at this stage, I wouldn't talk about a national program. There are still aggregated micro projects going on, most of the time depending on the funding available, and also depending very much on who is on the ground and who is taking this kind of initiative. Yeah. But they are beautiful initiatives, and we are, trying to replicate them as much as possible. When it comes to human trafficking, we have there are problem of child marriage, child labor, human trafficking, and each of them indeed, trigger attention of specialized agencies. The child marriage is an extraordinary, complicated one, and it's very, very difficult, to contain under, the circumstances, these refugees are living today. The child labor, again, is very difficult, to contain, especially in the agricultural sector, as long we have not addressed decent and dignified, livelihood for the refugees or the Lebanese on the ground. So, but yes, these are all, I would say, negative coping mechanisms which have emerged over the last few years, which require, our attention.
I have a question for you. You are in Washington, so what are the indications you are getting from the new administration about the level of assistance that they're going to put for Lebanon in terms of dealing with the refugees? Are you seeing changes? Brussels was a good example. Did you see some kind of a change in approach, or are we seeing more of the kind of level of support that the Obama administration?
I haven't started yet with the administration. I will start
but in
after.
Brussels,
But the indication we have got in Brussels is that for the time being, the attention will remain at the same level. Now, one of the objectives or one of the messages I'm trying to pass in DC, but also in Brussels, is we have to be careful. We need to maintain our attention on the neighboring country as long we do not have a proper political solution in the region, because most of the time when you enter into a protracted situation, the attention starts to erode, and we are tempted to divert our attention somewhere else. But if we do so, I mean, we are also putting at stake, I mean, the stability of Lebanon. And, I mean, as you know, many of you, this country remains certainly one of the last safe haven or model of diversity in the region, and hence a lot would be at stake. So that's the reason why the message being hammered is don't loosen your attention on a country like Lebanon, because if we do so, I mean, things can very rapidly, I mean, implode, and this would be a disaster.
Question.
Carla Jazar from the Lebanese Embassy. Thank you, Mr. Lazzarini, for this excellent and insightful presentation. I'm very happy to see this crowd. You know, it's such a puller. You know, this topic is such a puller. And thank you, Randa, also for, you know, raising awareness about this problem. And of course, Mr. Lazzarini, for this wonderful and insightful presentation. My question for you is, aside from the, of course, it's the right time, definitely, to be in Washington to see, because the budget has been passed yesterday, and it's the right time to be in Washington to see what are the perspectives for, you know, the UN agency's budget. But also there is an idea that is circulating in Washington in relation to safe zones in Syria. And there is a particular resolution in relation to the refugees in Lebanon being transported to a safe zone in Syria. What do you think of this idea?
You have the right not to answer, you know that.
No.
You can take the fifth. You know,
No. I mean, maybe two comments. If you refer to the agreement we have read in the media today, I don't know the detail.
De-escalation zone.
It's called de-escalation zone. Yeah. I think this is primarily geared or aimed at civilian population being in Syria, and they are the one who will benefit of this. Our position on safe zone, and I said it in fact many times, is that we have to be careful. The safe zone most of the time is a distraction. The safe zone can be a safe zone for civilian in country, internally displaced, but having a safe zone to allow refugees to go back in the country, not necessarily to their place of origin, means the zone has really to be safe for people to take the decision to go there. And as you know, the international community had a very, very bad experience. The last time we have declared a safe zone was in Srebrenica, Gorazde, Zepce in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which has ended up with a total disaster, because there was this wrong feeling that people might be protected by the international community, but in reality, they were not. So our approach is more to say, well, let's put in place the condition for the people to feel safe enough to go back to Syria. And that would be certainly, I mean, the best, safe zone, when people appreciate by themselves that indeed the situation is safe enough, to go back. So, but now we have to look at the detail. We talk about de-escalation zone. You might remember there was also in the past in Kurdistan and in Iraq the no-fly zone, which was intended to protect the population at least from aerial bombardment. But safe zone, you know, when we met in Brussels, before Brussels, some people say, well, maybe we should start to talk about reconstruction. That was even the title. But unfortunately, we had a stark reminder on the day of the Brussels conference after the chemical attack, and basically also showing that this can happen anywhere. So safe zone means also line of accountability. We need people who feel responsible to provide this safety, and I do not believe yet that there is enough appetite within the international community to provide, the boots or the resources to make this zone safe enough.
Thank Thank you. Sir, yes,
Yeah.
question.
My question was related to the safe zones. My name is Bashir Talk. I'm in the Lebanese embassy with my ambassador, Ms. Jazar. I just came from Lebanon a month and a half ago, a couple of months ago. So I was in Beirut. I was in charge of the foreigners department, so in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where you get all the birth of the Syrians. It was a huge amount. Of course, you know, in some areas in Lebanon, the Syrian birth rates is higher than the Lebanese population. Yeah. Again, I would like to say to everybody's here, yes, it is very, there's a lot of anxiety in Lebanon about the Syrian refugees. I've been there for 2.5 years in Beirut, and now we are here. And of course, here there is lots of talk recently, as Ms. Jazar mentioned, about the safe zones and the safe return of those refugees to Syria. But again, the refugees in Lebanon are divided between the people who ran away from the regime and some other who were running away from ISIS and its affiliates. So, and there is some talk even in Beirut, because some of those Syrians came from areas that are stable. As we know, Syria is a big country. Not all Syria there is war. And this is where there is some debates in Lebanon, like some of those Syrians are in Beirut, but they are benefiting from the United Nations agency's aid. Life in Lebanon, of course, we say miserable conditions, but as from my personal experience, what we see every day, the Syrians are getting married. They're having more than 2-3 babies in Lebanon. And this is where it is a concern, because those generations are born and raised in Beirut, and they will not know Syria. And lots of those refugees, they came from, they didn't come from the high-end areas of Damascus or Aleppo. They came from the countryside, the Rif, where it is really not easy to live there, but now they are living in Lebanon. So this is where, is there any United Nations, of course, you said the UN position about the safe zones, and of course it is very complicated because they're talking now, and the Trump administration there is some talk about the safe zones in North and South Syria, so the border of Jordan. Of course, with Lebanon and Syrian-Lebanese border is more complicated. But where, from your experience, you've been in Beirut, and I know how active you are there, and you see all the Lebanese politicians, do you think, is there any way to see where those, how could we define that the Syrian can go back to certain areas that is safe, or they have to stay in Lebanon? How can we define that those Syrians come from a safe area or not? And again, waiting for a political solution is going to take a long term. As you mentioned, it's going to be a generation pretty soon. We're 7 years now in the conflict. So I would like your input. You said about the safe zones. I know this would be a little bit, gives hope, because the politicians in Lebanon are talking about it as well. But as you mentioned, we have to be realistic as well. So I would like to see your input, to hear your input about those refugees. Is it possible for them to go at least to their areas if it's safe? Because as we know, not all Syria is under war right now. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, it's ultimately the decision of returning will be an individual decision from the refugees. I mean, experience shows that. Well, I mean, I think we will not enter into this debate. I think for the time being, we agree on safe return and dignified return. Yes, the Refugee Convention talk about voluntary return. It's an important one. The Lebanese government, because of its own political agenda, does not want to use the word voluntary, but agree with a safe and agree with a dignified return, and also agree to implement a policy of non-refoulement. So I think with this, we are all in agreement about, and that's the reason why, I mean, we are so appreciative, to the government of Lebanon policy of hospitality. That's a starting point. Now, do the refugee really will wait until someone say it's safe enough for you to go back? I mean, they are all plugged into what's going on in their place of origin. Experience has shown in so many other contexts that if a family or a member of the family feel that it is better now to go back because they feel safe enough and you can protect still the remaining assets, if they are still there, your land, your house, whatever, the infrastructure, they will go back. They will not wait the UNHCR or the UN or a given government to tell them, now it's safe enough, you can come back. So at the individual level, I mean, people are going back and forth. And as you indicated, you have two types of people, those who have fled the government and those who have fled, the ISIS or other armed group or the opposition. But we have also regular movement between Lebanon and Syria. And people are going, coming, coming. And most of the time, they do also their own assessment of the situation, not only for them, but mainly for their families. So I would say, yes, it's important to look at what are the necessary conditions for people to go back, and that's what we need to work on. Sometimes, even in the absence of a political solution, people might feel at ease enough, to take this type of decision. But experience has also shown that if people go too quickly and return again because they have to flee again, violence or a protection risk, these people are not going back anymore in their country. So this issue of the right moment is an important one, but it's also important after that, that we collectively, and Randa, we discussed this many times, that we have to look at what's the impact in the region for countries like Lebanon or Jordan, but here we're talking about Lebanon, of a presence after 7 years, after 10 years, 15 years. What does it mean? What does it mean for the country? Because, ultimately, we're talking about ensuring the future and shielding the country of, any danger which could lead, to further division or implosion or whatever. And I think that's what's ultimately really at stake. But for the return, I think our position, and I truly believe also about that, it's not something you can issue per decree, show through what's going on the ground that people can feel confident enough, to go back in safety in the country. And ultimately, it's an individual judgment.
Yes. Yeah. We have the lady there and the gentleman behind her. Please. Yeah. Are we tiring you?
Oh, there is water.
Thank you for your remarks. I'm Yasmin Masri, Search for Common Ground, Lebanon. I have two questions. The first one is, what are actually the measure or the strategy to hold the government accountable after the London conference? And the second one, we're talking a lot about actually increasing the acceptance of the host community for the refugees in Lebanon, while all of the funds right now are more towards PVE and TVE. So how can we actually increase the acceptance if we're not working on peace building, on actually the socioeconomic, to focus more on that while we're focusing on CVE and PVE? Thank you.
And then we're going to take the last question from the gentleman behind you. Yes, please, yes.
Stanley Cobra. The refugees are a product of the war in Syria.
Can you stand?
Oh,
yeah.
okay, let me put my computer down. The war in Syria seems to be escalating with Israeli attacks on Hezbollah. There has been war between Israel and Hezbollah before in Lebanon. Is there a danger that the war is now going to spread, that you will have more than a refugee crisis in Lebanon, that you will be sucked into the war itself?
Thank you. And yes, you wanted to ask. This is the last question. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Michel Dakash, a civil society activist in Lebanon. When we say refugee crisis in Lebanon, the first thing that came to our mind is the Syrian refugees. So unfortunately, we have lots of refugees in Lebanon, and once we see the Syrian crisis is not a pure humanitarian crisis due to the Lebanese community perspective. And on my daily living basis in Lebanon and my humble experience, when we say, for example, if we take about an example regarding the Iraqi refugees in Lebanon, they are well welcomed, they are well accepted, even finding their new jobs between the Lebanese community or other refugees. But when it comes to Syrian refugees, there is an issue which is, from my humble experience, the historical issue between the Syrian and the Lebanon. So my question is, do you have, as UN, a program regarding to how to deal with the past and a peace-building program between the Syrians and the Lebanese? Because this is the main issue that has to be worked in parallel as well as the humanitarian issue. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you. I will try to comment on, maybe not address all the questions, but on the issue of the London conference and the accountability of the government, one of the key asks at the London conference was the setting up of a coordination mechanism between the government and the international aid community. That's what we are calling the high-level steering committee, which is chaired by the Prime Minister, and this has been activated with this new government before we went to Brussels. So we have a proper platform today where we can engage on policy issues and to monitor also the delivery of our respective commitments. For example, when we were in London, the government committed to lift the pledge not to walk the Syrian refugees had to sign in a country at the beginning when they were registered. This has been lifted. There was an important ask at one point to waive the $200 residency fee. This has been waived by the government. So we have a mechanism where, indeed, we can follow up on mutual commitments. The international community say we will provide you X amount in country. We will make sure that your entire education system will be funded to ensure the enrollment of X number of children. Through this mechanism, we are indeed looking at who has delivered or not delivered. So I would say we have an instrument today which is in place. When it comes, to investment in the communities, investing in host communities is one of the two priorities of this Lebanese crisis response plan. But to go one step further, when we talk about PV or conflict prevention or promoting the stability of the country at a time it is exposed with all these turbulences in the region, the UN plan for the next coming 4 years is focusing on one hand on peace and security with the role of the peacekeeping mission in the south, but also by coordinating with the government the support of the LAF and also the support on some border initiative. The second pillar is the one which is related to promote better governance, transparency, support to upcoming election, to make sure also that standard which would promote better confidence from both the citizens but also international partners are being put in place. And the third one is the entire socioeconomic. And on the socioeconomic, on one hand, we have the issues related to the pre-existing problem in the country, and on the second hand, how to mitigate the impact of the Syrian crisis. Talking about the impact of the Syrian crisis, I go back to the comment of Mr. Dakasha. We don't talk about refugee crisis in Lebanon. We talk about the impact of the Syrian crisis, because it goes far beyond just the presence of the refugees. It's one element. It's a visible part of the iceberg. But in reality, we talk about the impact of the Syrian crisis. Now, you raise an interesting question on the healing process or transition justice. I started my career in Lebanon, in fact, in 89, 90, as a young ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross delegate. And I was there, during the last chapter of the civil war. I have to say I was struck, coming back 26 years later, to find out how little the generation which was born at the end of the Civil War knew what really happened during the Civil War. I mean, I have a number of staff who are 25, 28. They go to university to attend courses to try to understand what happened because there was a kind of total amnesia in their entourage. No one from the family, no one from, the close entourage was really talking about this. And then this need, is here. So that was something which, I have to say, struck me. But there is more and more interest of people to try to understand, because you need to understand if you don't want, to repeat, what happened. So definitely there is something to look after when it comes to this memory work that people in country need. On the last question about, the Hezbollah, Israel, we had a war in 2006. People are always anxious that there could be a repeat. There have been recently some escalation of rhetoric. There is always a risk of miscalculation, and depending on the period, this is an anxiety which resurfaces. I have to say, over the last few weeks, a number of people all of a sudden were concerned that this might lead to an uncontrollable, escalation. But again, this is my guess is as good as your guess. So I think I will not go far beyond that at this stage.
Thank you. Join me in thanking Mr. Lazzarini for a great discussion. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Comment allez-vous?